Thank you very much for this warm welcome. This is my very first trip to Brazil. I'm grateful for being invited by the Mises Institute Brazil, Mises Brazil, especially by Helio, and then the wonderful Kyokyo brothers. There are three of them who are taking part in this institute. So there's Cristiano. Finally, I've remembered the name because I called him all kinds of names: Francisco, Benedetto. So now it's Cristiano. Right? It's very, very simple. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. We won't tell all the jokes that we told the past few days. Cristiano, Roberto, and Fernando. Fernando is the happiest among the three brothers because he's the full-time libertarian activist. He has the pleasure to actually spend his time promoting the cause of liberty in Brazil, which brings me to my subject, which is liberty, the social order, and neoliberalism. Well, this is a very weird title. I mean, the second weirdest title that I ever had for a talk. The weirdest one was something like liberty, feminism, and money. And and the only reason money was in the title because I didn't want to call it liberty, feminism, and sex, which would have attracted even more people. So we brought in neoliberalism because apparently there are widespread misconceptions, maybe not in this group, but in Brazilian society at large, that neoliberalism is about the worst thing that we can imagine on the right. And this is the true enemy that we have to face by these nasty people around the various Mises institutes that now exist in the world. So the point of the talk would be to give a little bit of enlightenment and to set the record straight where the true enemy is. Because for us, after all, neoliberalism is a better sort of social democracy. So now I would like to put this into context in my talk. I will first deal a little bit about, make one or two additions to what Professor Hoppe said in his talk about private law and public law societies, discussing a little bit the definition of liberty, then stress the emphasis that the kind of libertarianism that we stand for is Austro-libertarianism. So it's a political ideology informed by economic theory. And this is something that is relatively new in history and is unique in the present ideological landscape. And then finally, I will put this into historical context and try to show that Austro-liberalism, as we understand it today, is in a very long historical continuity and can be traced back to the Middle Ages. So the first thing I think that should be stressed about the theory of Austro-libertarianism is that it is a political ideology. That is, the ultimate point is to discuss the conditions under which we may use force and also to define what is liberty and what is force in the first place. This is something that has been stressed in Murray Rothbard's book, The Ethics of Liberty, and in case it's not yet been translated into Portuguese, I encourage you guys, in particular Leandro is the chief translator of the Mises Brazil, to do this. This is a wonderful book and very important book in which Murray Rothbard just in the very opening chapters stresses that this is the whole point of political philosophy, to define what liberty is and its opposite, namely power or force, and to define the conditions under which the legitimate use of force is possible. Now, so if we want to define liberty and its opposite, force, we end up with a definition that Professor Hoppe has given, namely a definition that centers around the concept of private property. Now this, as outspoken as he has done it, is relatively recent. It can be traced back to Frédéric Bastiat, so a French economist who in the middle of the 19th century was the first economist to put the concept of private property in the center of economic reasoning. This is the starting point of all political thought. So we have a definition of liberty that says human beings are free to the extent that they freely dispose of their own body and freely dispose of all the things that they acquire through their own body. So they are the first users or first transformers of things that they find in nature. It's not the definition of liberty that we find very often in textbooks and in discussions in the media in the school, which says something like, I'm free to the extent that I can do whatever I wish. Freedom in the absence of any obstacles. Now, this is a very pure, real definition. It's probably the first one that one falls into spontaneously. And it's at best then modified to the extent in a social context when we define political liberty as saying, I'm free to do whatever I want as long as I grant the same liberty to other people. Now, that's a fairly vague definition. So first thing here to notice is liberty can never mean the absence of any obstacle. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a sort of liberty that at best God can have. Some of you might not believe in God, but I can tell you, even from a conceptual point of view, even if you don't believe in God, that's the only type of situation in which we can imagine a being that is completely free of any obstacles. It's only God that can do this. Human beings cannot do this. For example, in the very concept of choice, we are always, why do we have to choose? Well, because we have to choose. We cannot do two things at the same time. We would like to take part in this conference and also hang out at the beach, as Professor Kleiner said this morning, and we were all feeling with him very strongly, right, that he had to give this lecture rather than hang out at the beach and look at wonderful Brazilian women. Also, here I sense a very interesting cultural feature. Okay, well, so human beings have to choose. So this is, for example, one thing that we cannot wish away, right? In the very situation of choice, we cannot choose not to choose. There's always something to which we have to renounce, which we cannot abrogate through any political arrangement, any arrangement of our own life. We always have to renounce to certain things. There are always obstacles that we confront. The same thing, of course, also in personal, moral behavior. Right? We can, of course, wish that there be no moral standards or something, but I think this is wishful thinking, right, which ends up in relativism and so on. The fact is that we cannot wish standards away, so there are, whatever our behavior is, we do endorse certain things, we do reject other things. So liberty then, as far as human beings is concerned, is always constrained liberty. If we define liberty correctly, and we have an ordered liberty, and in defining liberty in relation to the concept of private property, and we are not, as Professor Hoppe has underlined, we're not coming up with a solution or with a conception that is unheard of, but which can trace back right to the Old Testament and probably even to older sources to the extent that we find any of those. Right? In the Old Testament, you have the first 3 or 4 commandments that stress allegiance to God and so our rights and our duties as far as God is concerned, and the rest turns around private property rights. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, and so on, which are all property-relevant concepts. So political liberty then in the Austro-libertarian tradition, which reaches back far into the past, is the concept of ordered liberty. It's constrained liberty. And the resulting social order is then one ruled by natural law. It's a natural order. This is also something that Professor Hoppe has stressed. The particularity of Austro-libertarianism is that it goes into more detail analyzing the logical alternative to this constrained liberty, namely intervention through the force of government. So we can now define what force is, we can define what power is. Force or power relations are all those that involve the violation of property rights. Violations of property rights, be they be committed by ordinary criminals or be they committed by governments. And as far as the social consequences are concerned, there are a few differences. What Austrians, and before them, some of the classical economists have then stressed, their originality consists in analyzing the consequences of violations of property rights. And we can summarize these consequences under 2 or 3 headings. The first one would be all government interventions either hamper the exercise of natural liberty and therefore hamper natural productivity. And in hampering natural productivity, they impoverish society. This is the case when governments tax. This is the case when governments regulate the population, so they impose different behavior on them than they would have chosen spontaneously. Second, governments encourage irresponsible behavior. And in encouraging irresponsible behavior, they also inflict losses on society. This is very clear-cut in the present situation on the financial markets, right, which are in a deep crisis thanks to a very long-standing government intervention that has systematically de-responsibilized banks and other financial market participants. And we have central banks that have been created through government institutions, through laws, and the purpose of which was to stabilize the price level, or stabilize the banking system, and which, as a consequence, have encouraged irresponsible behavior on the side of banks and other financial participants. Right? Central banks bail out and refinance under particularly favorable conditions banks, and as a consequence, these banks have less incentives to protect themselves. So they hold less liquidity, they hold less equity, and they also have a greater incentive to engage in risky investments, which tend to provide greater returns. And as a consequence, then, we have the current mess on the financial markets. We have a very fragile financial industry all over the world, and which is therefore liable to be plagued by recurrent crisis, as we see in the present context. Again, so this is not the consequence of some recent policy error, but of a long-standing policy. It's the consequence of decades-long interventionism in financial and monetary affairs. Finally, governments impoverish us third. So the first thing would be by regulating and taxing the population. The second thing would be the encouragement of irresponsible behavior. And third, governments impoverish us by creating illusory security, or by creating illusions as far as the true nature of causal relations are concerned. So governments, precisely because their policies tend to impoverish the population, pursue also policies to cover up these facts. That's the reason, as Professor Hoppe, again, has underlined in various of his writings, that's the reasons why governments have, for centuries, sought to obtain a monopoly on public education, and have obtained it. That's the reason why governments have tried to control the media, control the flow of information through the postal system in former times, then in the 20th century through control of the radio and TV stations. And one of the amazing things of the internet is that for the first time, probably ever in recorded human history, governments have not been able to control, or fully control at any rate, a major vehicle of information flows. So this conception of liberty, which is informed by economic theory, is new in a historical perspective. Antiquity did not have this conception of liberty. The Greeks had a conception of liberty, but this conception of liberty was confined to the political community. There was no liberty outside of the political community, outside of the polis. Outside of the polis, there was only conflict and risky behavior. For the Romans, it was the same thing. The Romans had a concept of liberty within the empire, but not outside of the empire. There was no notion of how people belonging to different political communities could be involved in an overarching network of peaceful exchange. This did not exist. There was a pax romana only to the extent that the confines of the empire reached. And then within the empire, the Romans created something that was indeed unheard of and necessary for the advancement of modern civilization, namely the concept of universal law or natural law. The Romans were the inventors of natural law. And the way they did it was because they had to rule over different peoples, And the different peoples had different law codes, exactly as Professor Hopper has explained to us just an hour ago. Right? So this is not just a theoretical exercise. Right? He said we can have different insurance companies, and they might offer product differentiation. Some group might be ruled according to Mosaic law, another group according to canon law, and et cetera, et cetera. This was the actual practice in the Roman Empire. Right? So we had different groups, they had different laws, and they were judged according to this law. But then there was still the problem of regulating the relationships between these different groups. So what if a member of the Jewish nation, at the time there were no nation, of the Jewish tribe, got in conflict with a Phoenician merchant and so on? What had to happen then? So then the Roman emperors encouraged the formation of a universal law code that would apply to such cases of conflicts. And this law code was, at the beginning, formulated by one major civil servant. So he set up all the set of rules according to experience, right? They judged the different cases and said, so in this case, we could apply this principle because it was a universal principle. And so they had a list of all these stipulations, and later on systematized this list and so on, and it was revised more or less every year, right? So it's a constant improvement of the product, so to say. And eventually, as a result of many hundreds of years of experience in educating cases, the Romans had developed a whole law book, or code of law, of universal law applying to all nations. And this is the Corpus Juris that came into full definition in the beginning of the 6th century. Now, but still, right, this universal law was not strictly speaking concerned to be universal beyond the borders of the empire. This is an idea that no Roman had. It held only within the empire. Things changed then after the collapse of the Roman Empire and the emergence of a new intellectual movement in the Middle Ages, which was Scholasticism, about which we also heard already this afternoon in our lecture on epistemology. So we had this scholastic movement that arrived with Albert the Great and Albertus Magnus and then St. Thomas, and which strived to find natural law not only in the analysis of nature, and not only try to, so not only, well, I mean, should be start more fundamentally, the main concern of the churchmen was always the salvation of the soul. But they pushed the analysis further away. So they were asking the question, why do people sin? Why do people fall into temptation and so on? So for many centuries, they just inquired the individual soul, but eventually they came to extend this analysis to the environment of individual human beings. So they started analyzing natural forces, they started analyzing nature, physics, biology, and so on, and they eventually also turned to the laws of society. So all this was new, and all this came into full swing in the 13th century. Now the churchmen, this new scholasticism, this new intellectual movement, operated under different conditions. They were present in all countries, and there were now different countries that had succeeded the Roman Empire and cooperated with one another without a common code of law. There was no empire, no one political community that imposed its rule on all countries. There were now different countries with different citizens cooperating amongst one another, but also with the citizens of other countries. So now the concept of natural law had acquired a whole new meaning. It now really meant, it was clear that natural law stretched beyond any political community and that it covered humanity as a whole. And in this conception, of course, the concept of private property played a central role. Right? So you have, in Catholic doctrine, you have 4 so-called cardinal virtues. You have prudence, justice, temperance. Oh, wow, I don't remember what the fourth one was. It will come back later. It was probably one of my sins, yeah. You're always weak. I'm surprised that I remember temperance. So the crucial virtue is prudence, which covers anything that pertains for us today to intellectual life. So it doesn't mean prudence being careful and so on. It means circumspection, taking into consideration all circumstances that determine our course of action, both in the present and in the future. And second to this virtue was only the virtue of justice. And at the center of this virtue of justice is the concept of suum cuique, to each according to what is due to him. And what is due to each person is, in fact, his property. So private property was at the center of thinking about justice and universal justice as from the Middle Ages. Then came the Reformation, and the Reformation, the Protestant movement, did not at all aim, as you might think, while watching what is going on in the certain Protestant churches, especially in Europe today, did not at all aim at overthrowing the established moral order and the established virtues, but precisely at reinforcing them. And so the Protestants thought that the Catholics were in fact too lax. And that was the reason. Luther went to Rome and thought he had come to Sodom and Gomorrah, thought that this is way too lax. I mean, the Catholics have fallen from the faith. They are no longer just, they're no longer prudent, they will all go to hell. And we need to reform the church, that is bringing back into the form into which it was brought by the creator of the church, namely by Jesus Christ. So, as from the Reformation then, so we're talking at the beginning of the 16th century, come about 200 or 300 years of fierce religious competition between the Catholic Church on the one hand and various Protestant denominations on the other hand, all vying for the best definition of what the true moral order is. These things only changed in the 20th century. In the 20th century, the Protestant churches have started competing in the opposite direction, that is, trying to come up with new definitions that would allow Christians not to adhere to traditional standards of moral behavior. And this is the reason for the decline of most Protestant denominations today. So in any case, so the point is then, as a consequence of this competition and religious production, encouragement of moral behavior, we created the condition in Europe, in the offsprings of European culture, in the various colonies, in the Americas, but also in Asia and in Africa, right, for the operation of spontaneous societies that did not have to rely on a monopolist law enforcer. Right? Societies, by and large, functioned independent of the presence of an emperor, of one monopolist police organization. Now this, then, were the condition under which one group of the scholastic intellectual movement of the scholastics, namely the school of Salamanca, right, so Spanish and Italian theologians headquartered in the Spanish city of Salamanca, discovered for the first time the existence of what Hayek would later call a spontaneous order. The market economy and the economy as a whole could function, by and large, independent of the existence of governments. The market, it was a self-enforcing order, and it relied on moral behavior, spontaneous moral behavior from all its participants, and in itself, it encouraged such behavior because the liberty that existed was an ordered liberty that enforced responsibility. And if you enforce responsibility, if the negative consequences of your choices fall back on yourself, then you have interest in acting prudently and respecting traditional moral standards of behavior, which are not just decoration, but precisely protect you against adverse consequences of choices and bad choices. So the school of Salamanca for the first time discovered the existence of a spontaneous order. Right? There are laws of society that have not been enacted by any legislation, that have not been enacted by any king or tyrant and so on, but are regularities that exist independent of human willing. And successful economies are ruled by those laws, and violations of those laws entailed negative consequences for the economy as a whole. The next step, and this was a crucial breakthrough, arrived in the 18th century with the discoveries of the causes of the wealth of nations, to adopt the title of Adam Smith's famous treatise. Right? Adam Smith was fairly unoriginal as far as individual points of this intellectual edifice were concerned, but he was the writer who brought all of this together into one picture. So Adam Smith, for the first time, created a literary work that presented the operation of the developed market economy, a relatively developed market economy, and pointed the true forces of material progress, the true forces of causes of material progress for society as a whole were not, as most people at the time had it, government intervention in the form of trade policy, what we would call today trade policy, and in the form of monetary interventionism. But the true causes of wealth were the division of labor and capital accumulation. So we had then, at the end of the 18th century, reached a new stage, right? We had for the first time developed a theory of liberty. Adam Smith talked of the natural condition of liberty, the junction of natural law, the junction of a new definition of liberty, with a combination of economic theory. Right? So the defense of liberty was not only made in moral terms, not in theological terms, but now also in economic terms. And the disciples of Adam Smith, the classical economists, would reinforce this consideration over the next century. Among them was Frédéric Bastiat, whom I already mentioned. So he has a couple of famous papers which I encourage you to read in case you haven't done it, and also Leandro to translate them in case it hasn't yet been done. And for example, his essay on the law, or his essay on property and freedom, in which he stressed the central importance of property not only in practical respect, but also as an analytical tool. Right? All reasoning about human behavior, about human action, must involve and must start from the concept of private property. And in the late 19th century then, and in the 20th century, the same approach was taken up and developed by the Austrian School of Economics. What makes the Austrians unique today, and why you need a Mises Brazil, is because the Austrians, unfortunately, are the only ones who are still upholding this. For reasons that would lead us now way too far astray, all other schools of economic thought have abandoned this tradition, have deviated from it in various ways. There was a technical deviation, right, in which economists became primarily occupied with the development of new analytical techniques and so on, bringing mathematics and econometrics and so on into economic analysis and forgetting the larger picture, right, falling into error in these various ways. Other schools of economics were, of course, from the outset thoroughly opposed to the whole notion of natural liberty. For example, the Marxists fell prey ultimately to the very basic error that I briefly mentioned at the beginning of my talk, namely the idea that you could define liberty without, as being a condition without any obstacles at all. And that's Marx's definition of liberty. So as a consequence, Marx thinks that the ultimate thing that needs to be done once you have eradicated all tyrants and all kings and so on is to get rid of property altogether, because property is the last obstacle that stands in the way of full liberty. So Marx thinks that human beings could do what only God can do, namely creating liberty without any obstacles. So the Austrians today are upholding a tradition that reaches back at least until the the first scholastics, the disciples of St. Thomas. Right? A tradition that defines justice, well-ordered society around the concept of property, of what belongs to each, the suum cuique. And this conception has been enriched in the past 200 years by taking account of the economic dimension. And the economic dimension has informed us especially about the consequences of violations of this order, because this was fairly abstract. Right? You violate property rights, okay, you end up in hell. Right? But what the economists have shown is, well, you violate property rights, then you get shortages and surpluses on the economy, you get economic crisis and other nasty things, you get huge income differentials, as the ones that we have had in the past 30 or 40 years, right, being the consequence of inflationist policies. Right? All this has been possible only thanks to the development of economic theory. It was not possible before. So we can reject, we are in the happy position therefore today that we can reject government interventions not only because it's immoral, because they are immoral, but also because they entail various nasty material consequences. It's not that therefore we will find much hearing in the capital cities here in Brazil and in other countries, but right, we will find the hearing of all people of goodwill and who eventually will become a majority. Now, simultaneously to this development that I've just outlined, the opposition, the forces of evil, so to say, also gain some ground. And although we could trace them back much earlier, I will start my recital of the forces of evil with the Enlightenment movement in the 18th, or let's say late 17th and then 18th century. The Enlightenment people took up the conception of liberty of antiquity. That is, they defined liberty as being relative to political power only. Only political power could create a condition of liberty for its citizens. And so the government was, in fact, the source of liberty, was the source of order. You see, so they come up with this idea, it's kind of a reactionary movement, right? They dish this up again at the end of the 17th and then in the 18th century, although, in fact, this whole notion had been overcome now for 2 or 3 centuries. The facts were clear, the case was patent, that social order in a well-ordered society can extend far beyond the political borders of any king or of any democracy. Right? So they come back and say, no, in any case it should be the other way around. They have the conception that government is the true spring out of which flow liberty and order. And they combine this with a mechanic view of man, contrary to what is sometimes presented in histories of the Enlightenment and so on. In fact, the Enlightenment philosophers in France in particular, Rousseau, Voltaire, Helvetius, and all the others, did not have a particularly elevated notion of man. Rather, for them, mankind fell by and large into 2 groups. One group was the huge mass of people who had no free will, in fact, at all. They were entirely determined by outside forces. They were machines, unthinking machines, cattle. And the other group was a very small minority that was themselves and their friends. They were, in fact, the only ones to make any choice at all, and they had, therefore, not only the right, but also the mission to create society or create conditions for society, a legal framework, such that the desired outcomes would entail. Right? All others behave like machines, so they, as the social philosophers, only have to create the right laws so that all others would be determined to go into the desired direction and create happiness and wealth for everybody. That was by and large their conception of society. So today we would call this social engineering. Right? It's an expression that only emerged in the 20th century, and Hayek used it. But in fact, this is exactly the condition, the conception that we find already in the 18th century in the whole philosophy that leads up to the French Revolution. After the French Revolution, in the 1810s, we see the emergence of liberalism. The word liberalism is used for the first time, as most of you know, in the Spanish Parliament, and where one group of representatives call themselves the liberales, those who seek liberty. Now, liberalism, classical liberalism, was a very mixed bag. It had two inspirations. One was of an Anglo-Saxon or Scottish type, as Hayek has underlined. And this Anglo-Saxon inspiration, this Anglo-Saxon tradition of liberalism relied on the origins, on the roots that were developed in the Middle Ages and then through the schoolmen. The other route was the Enlightenment movement. And that was, unfortunately, the majority among the liberals of the early 19th century. So those liberals had a very strong opposition against anything that resembled organized religion. They were atheists, sometimes very militant atheists. They thought that man was a machine, and that therefore the duty of the lawmaker was to create conditions favorable, that pushed the different market participants into desired forms of behavior, etc. So we today, I think, we cannot fully identify with classical liberalism. I felt for a long time, well, as classical liberalism, the classical liberals were the predecessors of the modern Austrian school and of Austro-libertarianism. But in fact, if we look at the historical record somewhat carefully, we must be prudent, right? So in many ways, classical liberalism, what we call classical liberalism, was a deviation. It was a mixed bag that not relied on the crucial elements that we consider to be important, self-ordering society, starting from the concept of private property, but on the ancient conception of liberty springing only from political power. And we see a repeat of the same intellectual error in the 20th century in the case of the neoliberal movement. The word neoliberalism emerges, or is used for the first time, in the German literature of the 1930s. And the people who use it want to distance themselves from classical liberalism. They found that classical liberalism was too libertarian. They had in fact swallowed root and branch the Marxist interpretation of 19th century history. The Marxists had said, look, we had created the conditions of capitalism, freedom under the sole rule of law and the sole rule of property rights. Look what this has given us. Mass misery for the working classes and economic crisis. So obviously, this doesn't work. It doesn't give us the desired results, and on top of this, it impoverishes us. So we need to come up with something new, and in this new conception, we need to leave some room for individual freedom. So the conception that they developed was essentially the same one that the Enlightenment philosophers had, and essentially the same one that the Roman and Greek philosophers had, namely that all freedom flows from the government, and that the duty of the government is to set a framework of conditions, a framework of laws that determine all the market participants to adopt behavior that is socially desirable, that is desirable from the point of view of the politicians. And their error was, of course, well, manifold. Right? First of all, they erred historically. It was not the case that the liberalization reforms of the 19th century had entailed mass misery for the masses. It was precisely the other way around. In no history, in no period of history before, and even in our own day, except for maybe for the globalization of the past 30 years, has the condition of the masses of people ever been increased at such a fast rate. And that was in particular the case in the second half of the 19th century. Right? It was unprecedented increases of the real wages of the working population. They erred also in the interpretation of economic crisis. There were regular financial crises in the 19th century, and they all originated, or most of them originated anyway, in the financial sector. And that was precisely because the financial sector was not free from government intervention, but was the one sector where government intervened ever more. And I mentioned before that our present crisis can be traced back to decades-long government interventions in monetary affairs. In fact, governments have always tried to control the money supply, because that's an additional source of income for governments. And these interventions have not been given up in the 19th century, but have been reinforced in the 19th century. So we observe already in the 19th century the same problems that we find today on a much larger scale. And in Nietzsche, it's the same kind of problem. You have central banks bailing out commercial banks, refinancing commercial banks. Commercial banks, therefore, engage in unsustainable business practices, right? They run down their liquidity, run down equity, engage in very risky investments, and every 10 years or so, the whole thing blows up. Right? So it was a wrong interpretation of the historical record, and especially it was just wrong economic analysis. Right? The neoliberals, as they emerged in the 1930s, hadn't learned their economics. And if you look at those people who adopted, right, came up with this new term, hardly any one of them had an education in classical economics or knew something about the Austrian school. Right? They were raised on a different school of thought that was dominant in Germany in those days, which was the historical school. The historical school stressed the study of empirical conditions, right, and claimed that out of the study of many case conditions and so on, you could develop more general regularities, which was a big error. So from then on, well, the neoliberals first didn't have a big influence, but they came to have a big influence after World War II because they played a role in the organization of the first international libertarian organizations. And among those first libertarian organizations were the Mont Pelerin Society in particular, and various liberal institutes, especially on the European continent. So the line stretched by the Mont Pelerin Society, so in the Mont Pelerin Society, then you had a confrontation between the neoliberals on the one hand, people like Wilhelm Röpke, Alfred Müller-Armack, and others, and then the representatives of the Austrian school, Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises on the other hand. So it was not a unified front against the forces of socialism, but Mises and Hayek realized perfectly well, and Mises much more than Hayek, that ultimately the neoliberals had a completely wrong conception about the conditions of liberty in a well-ordered society, and therefore fought these conceptions. Mises never called himself a neoliberal, and he was a liberal of the old sort, right? The 19th century type liberalism, by which he meant essentially the type of liberalism that could be traced back to Adam Smith and the classical economists, not the type of liberalism that could be traced back to the French Enlightenment. So in conclusion, and I will stop here and give some more time to our discussion, and we have to see that our current struggles are in continuity of a century-long evolution. Right? We're not in a unique historical situation. Of course, it's unique in several respects, but by and large, we are leading today in all countries the same struggle that has been led over centuries. Yet the forces of good, to which, of course, we belong, which define the desired ideal state of society, a free society, a well-ordered society, in terms of justice, at the center of which is private property, with the help of economic arguments that have been developed in the past 200 years, and which stresses, therefore, that a society can function without a central enforcer a monopolist enforcer of property rights, right? As Professor Hoppe has explained, the protection of property rights themselves is part of the well-ordered society, so it has to respect those property rights in itself. So the foundation of a well-ordered society are the moral conceptions that stress the respect of property rights, and the consequence is also respect of property rights, because we have here a feedback mechanism, right? By always stressing the central position of property rights, we enforce responsibility, and therefore we cultivate a culture of responsibility at the center of which are property rights. And the greatest enemy in all of this, well, of course, we can say, make things easy and say, well, the greatest enemy is the state, right? It's coercive government that destroys social order, that impoverishes us. But ultimately, the greatest enemy is not government itself. The greatest enemies are our wrong conceptions of what true liberty is and what violations of liberty is, what the foundations of justice are, and what the foundations of material wealth are. So we have to, first of all, clarify the ideas for ourselves, and then use this to convince others, that is, and spread our views of society by, as being part of a civil society, that is, by respecting property rights. And this has been done very successfully, as I experienced personally. I'm not that old. I mean, I'm about 20 years younger than Professor Klein, but even in the past 15 years, I've seen enormous progress in all countries which I've traveled for the cause of liberty, and which can rely on these powerful ideas that we've heard already expressed at this conference, and about which we will learn more tomorrow. And I think in Brazil, you have now the second Austrian seminar, which will be the second one of many more to come. And it's clear that these ideas, I have no doubt about this, that these ideas will steamroll this country, right, exponentially. At the beginning slope, right? In about 10 years or so, you'll be at 10% of the voter potential, and then in another 30 years, you'll have the majorities. That was the case of the classical liberals too, right? A true revolutionary, and I have 3 more minutes, okay, a true revolutionary can be recognized by the fact that he says something that is not acceptable at first to the majority of his citizens. That was the case of Adam Smith. He said unheard of things. He said, the cause of our wealth is not inflation, it's not the creation of money, it's not spending, it's not the price level, it's not the stabilization of the price level. The true causes of our wealth are capital accumulation, savings, a frugal life. Then all politicians at the time said, oh, are you crazy? We're saving? You mean not spending? Right? And of course they were not open to this kind of ideas, but after 60 years they were at the point of being the majority opinion in England. It eventually became majority opinion in other countries as well. Right? And the same thing I expect also to be the case in the 21st century, which I expect to be the century of the cause of liberty. Thank you for your attention.
Obrigada. Bom, vamos abrir então esse último painel do dia. Alguém gostaria de começar fazendo perguntas? Uma pergunta? Por favor, eu tenho ali um participante. Vamos esperar chegar o microfone. Tem outra pergunta? Ali, ó, por favor.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. How would you explain the decline of classical liberalism throughout the 20th century?
How would I explain the decline of classical liberalism throughout the 20th century? Well, again, we have to recognize that the classical liberals had very powerful enemies. Right? And so who were the governments at the time? Primarily we had monarchical governments who were small by present-day standards, right? So I mean, even somebody like Louis XIV, he controlled a very tiny part, actually, of the GDP of France at the time, maybe 10 or 15%, which was next to nothing, right? So, but still, so they resented the loss of power that was inflicted on them by the rise of the classical liberal movement. So what they did was, in a way, very similar to what the various parts of the US administration have been doing in the past 20 years, ever since the Soviet Empire collapsed. Right? So the biggest part of American government spending or federal spending concerned the military, so that was no longer necessary, so they could have reduced spending, right? Reduced the apparatus and so on. They did the exact opposite by looking for new missions. And they did the same thing too. Right? So the British ruling class in the middle of the 19th century, when it was clear that the liberals were gaining the upper hand inside of the country, were then exporting their activities to other countries, starting the colonization movement, reinforcing the colonization movement in order to create jobs and revenues for the scions of noble families. That's what they did. And then, of course, right, you have another wave of interventionism, right, because this creates, of course, hostile relationships abroad, so there are conflicts abroad, there's a greater necessity, so-called, so to say, to send more troops in, right? You get an endless sequence of further government interventions. So what they did was then, in a way, it was a very creative backlash. They invented new reasons to intervene and created new problems that the classical liberals had not yet addressed. Right. And forged new alliances. The most famous case was the one of Bismarck, so the representative of the old aristocratic ruling classes in Germany, who forged an alliance with the labor movement against the liberals. On the day when the German Allied forces had conquered Paris, there was the German-French War in 1870, 1871. On the day when the French had surrendered, Bismarck, right? Bismarck said, "Oh, how happy are we that finally the frogs have surrendered," or something like this. He didn't say this. He said, "Now the German liberals are done. Now the German liberals are done." Okay. So it was a relentless war with new techniques and so on, fought very creatively, and to which the classical liberals, or the liberals at the time, did not react with sufficient vigor at the beginning. And there was temptation that some of them were co-opted into the governments, or they got revenues and nice positions and so on. So I hope that all of you guys will stay very rich so that you cannot be tempted by government, right? But this, of course, that's what governments typically do. They try to corrupt the opposition. That's what they do in all African countries. They have ample resources to do so, right? So the libertarians, modern-day libertarians, need to be creative and inventive too, right? But we have, of course, a much more powerful intellectual arsenal today than we had in those days, right? Of course, also much more intelligence of the mechanisms of power and so on. But still, it's a very hard battle. And I don't say it's won from the outset, but I'm very optimistic that we will win.
Foi enviada uma outra pergunta, eu vou tentar traduzir. Do you believe that the Austrian school is the closest school to the Catholic ethic tradition?
Yes, yeah. I myself, I'm a Catholic, and it's not just my personal fancy, but again, I see that this traces back many centuries into the past. Right? The first intellectuals who had gained an understanding of how market works, and that markets are by and large spontaneous formations, were Catholic intellectuals, and they combined this with Catholic theology. And I still think that that's the case today. Now, as far as Austro-libertarianism is concerned as a political movement, of course, you don't have to be a Catholic in order to subscribe. Of course, as a Catholic, I'm particularly convinced that there's mutual reinforcement in several respects here. But even, let's say, if you're an atheist, you might come to the same political conclusion. Right?
Mais alguma pergunta da audiência? Vamos esperar só chegar o microfone, por favor, porque nós estamos transmitindo.
Okay, what you would say if they tried to intervene in the economic system, in the market, with some Catholic rules, let's say? What would be your opinion about that?
Yeah, I think that this would be a violation of what the church should stand for, right? The church, as you know, right, has for many centuries been crystal clear about the question whether there should be forced conversions, for example. Right? From the 16th centuries, the Pope has stressed this: there should be no forced conversion. We have to respect the natural liberty of each individual person, and so on. But if we are against forced conversions, then how can we force upon the population any other aspect, right, of Catholic doctrine? So this is contradictory, I think, and it would be destructive of religion, of organized religion. We see this in several countries in Europe. For example, in Germany, all bishops are paid by the state. All bishops are paid by the government out of church taxes collected by the federal government. France, it's similar. All right, the government pays for all churches and so on, for the maintenance. Now, I mean, if you consider this of course creates a very perverse incentive system, because then the clergy comes to identify with very secular concerns of the state and of the government out of material self-interest, just to keep the church activities going. This is destructive of the church. Therefore, church attendance is at an all-time low in Germany and also in France. We will get out of this only if there's a radical separation of the church from the state, right? You need everything that the state touches is a deadly grip, right? It's a kiss of death, right? So whatever you love, whether it's your language or your poetry or songs and so on, be sure there's no government intervention there. After 30 years, it's dead, can be sure.
So on behalf of Mrs. Brazil, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. Thank you so much.